Miles and miles in buffalo dung. Get on now, Fergus. Get on, Jed. Pa hollered to the oxen from his horse. He and the other men rode their horses alongside the teams of oxen to keep them moving. Sam wished he were older so he could help, but all he could do was walk with Lizzie and Ma and the other women and children. Amelia rode in the wagon most of the time. When she did get out to walk, the new dog stayed close and nudged her every time she slowed down. You're like a sheepdog, rounding everybody up. Sam reached down to pet Ranger's head. I wish I knew your name. I guess you can just be Dog for now. I'm amazed that you convinced your father to keep him, Ma said. But Sam had seen Pa looking back at the farm when they had pulled out of Boonville a week ago. They had heard Scout barking all the way down the road. Pa's eyes had been just as shiny and wet as Sam's. He missed Scout, too. Sam looked over his shoulder. An endless train of wagons stretched out behind them, all heading west. I sure hope the Willamette Valley has as much land as they say. I don't think anyone's going to be left back east. We could still turn around, Lizzie said, scuffling her boots in the dust. Let everyone else run off to be taken ill and attacked by Indians. We'll be just fine, Lizzie, Ma said, but she started humming a hymn from church. She did that when she felt anxious, Sam knew. With such a long list of bad things that could happen out on the trail, she was humming a lot these days. Mr. Palmer says most of the Indians are friendly and just want to trade, Sam said. He says some help with river crossings. Well, that's good, Ma said, and her humming quieted down. Ma and Pa trusted Mr. Palmer's book. The guidebook also said that traveling in groups made the journey safer, and there were 20 wagons in the Abbott's train. Sam's family and 9 others were from Missouri, all hoping to settle on better farmland out west. The Harrigans and Middletons were from Iowa, had the same goal, along with Dr. Loring and his wife, plus 6 other families from Indiana. Sarah Ferguson and her parents were part of the wagon train, too. They were traveling from a place called Nauvoo, Illinois, to the Great Salt Lake, where there was a much bigger community of Mormon families, including all those cousins Sarah was so good at chasing. For now, though, Sarah spent her time helping with Amelia, and Mrs. Abbott was happy to have another older child keeping watch. Some of the men traveling alone hadn't bothered with wagons. Henry and Ezra Beard, brothers from St. Louis, only had mules. They were going to California to find gold. When it was almost time for supper, the Beard brothers rode ahead to find a camping place. When everyone else arrived, all 20 wagons pulled into a circle for the night. Not bad for the first day. 17 miles, Mr. Ferguson called out to the group. The Fergusons had something called a rodometer attached to their wagon. It used cogs and gears to record the number of times the wagon wheels went around, and then turned that number to miles. Sarah told Sam it was invented a few years ago by a couple of Mormon pioneers who got tired of counting the wagon wheel rotations to measure distance. Can you imagine? They tied a rag to the wheel to make it easier to count rotations, she said. 360 turns made a mile. Probably helped pass the time, Sam said, reaching down to scratch Ranger's ear. There wasn't much else to do while you walked along with the wagon. He was glad they were done traveling for the day. Pa yoked the oxen for the night, and Ma let the chickens out to peck for bugs and worms in the grass. Sam and Sarah and the other children gathered for wood for the fires. Then the women cooked up beans and bacon and trail bread for supper. It had been such a long day of walking that Sam went right to sleep, even though his bed was just a couple of blankets spread under the wagon. He drifted off to the sound of horses chewing and fussing, Mr. Harrigan playing his fiddle, a few wagons down, and Ranger snoring softly beside of him. In the morning they had breakfast, loaded the wagons, hitched up the teams of oxen, and started off again. It wasn't a fast walk, but it was long. They only stopped once during the day at noontime. Sometimes Sam ran ahead with Amelia and Sarah and helped them pick flowers for Ma and Mrs. Ferguson. Lizzie spent most of her time complaining. It was always too hot, or too warm, or too dusty. It was never home. Sam understood that. He missed the farm and his relatives who'd stayed behind in Boonville. He missed Scout, but he was glad his new dog had decided to come along. It was good to have furry company, especially with Lizzie being so cranky. They made it 20 miles the second day, 18 on the third, just 12 the next day because they had to wait to ferry across the stream. With so many wagons heading west, it was hours before the Abbotts had their turn. It was the longest walk Ranger had ever been on, like going with Luke and Sadie to the park and home over and over and over without ever stopping to chase balls. Where was Luke? Ranger looked for him every time the Abbotts pulled into camp for the night, and every morning before they started out again. There were so many voices, so many faces, but none of them belonged to Luke. As the days went by, everyone traveled more slowly. People got sick. Some of them got better, but not all. The smell of newly turned dirt made Ranger's fur stand up each time they passed a fresh grave. The landscape changed too. The earth was rough and sandy now, and the oxen's feet were swollen and cracked. The dust and rocks hurt Ranger's paws too, but at least he had plenty of scraps to eat. The oxen were struggling to find enough grass. Poor Fergus and Jed, Sam said. The buffalo out here have eaten up all the grass. When they'd left Independence the second week of May, there were plenty of trees along the way. Now wood was scarce. The women had started bringing back buffalo dung for fires instead. Buffalo chips made a fine, clean fire. They were easy to find, but no one in the Abbott's wagon train had actually seen an actual buffalo. As far as Lizzie said, she'd never eat anything cooked over buffalo chips, but that didn't last long. Lizzie was as hungry as anyone else after a day of walking. One night in early June, the Abbotts made camp along Little Blue River. Sam was watching Amelia alone. Sarah's father wasn't feeling well, so he was busy helping her mother care for him. Lizzie and Ma had just come back to the wagon with their aprons full of buffalo chips when Sam thought he heard a rumbling. There were often thunderstorms on the prairie. He looked west, expecting to see storm clouds, but the sky was as blue as could be. "You hear that?" Sam asked Ranger. Ranger not only heard it, he felt it in his paws. The rumbling was shaking the ground. He pawed at the dirt and pricked up his ears. "You do hear that, don't you, boy?" Sam squatted down next to Ranger. "What is it, dog?" Ranger whined. He sat up and sniffed the air. Amid the dust and oxen and people smells, there was something new. Animal smell. Big animal smell. Ranger tipped his head and barked. "There." He barked again and again. Sam tried to pet him. "It's all right, dog. That thunder's far away." But Ranger pulled away and ran in circles, jumping and barking. Then he came back and pawed at Sam's leg. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" It reminded Sam of the time Scout had gone crazy, barking and jumping when their old barn caught fire. Scout had realized before anyone else that something was wrong. "Paw," Sam called. "Come quick." Paw hurried over, and Ranger jumped right upon him. "What in heaven's name is the matter, dog?" Ranger barked and turned to the river. Paw stared across the river to the plains and on the other side, and his eyes grew wide. He whirled around to Sam. "Find your sisters and get in the wagon. Hurry." Then Paw turned to the rest of the men. He hollered at the top of his voice, "Circle the wagons! The buffalo are coming!"